Sign it now, you fool, or I'll auction off your reputation before dessert is served. Derek's voice sliced through the hushed elegance of Bellevue Estate's private gallery, and 60 pairs of eyes turned toward our table like synchronized theater. He threw the papers across the auction catalog with enough force to scatter champagne droplets across the linen, and I watched the amber liquid bead on documents that would supposedly transfer my $8.7 million inheritance directly into his hands. The LED screen behind us displayed Lot 47, my grandfather's 1947 Henri Rousseau original, the painting that had hung in his study for 50 years before he left it to me, along with everything else Derek was now claiming belonged to him by marriage. Lawrence Bellevue stood at the podium, frozen mid-gesture, his auctioneer's gavel suspended in air as my husband of 4 years transformed a $200,000 art auction into his personal stage for humiliation. "I'm serious, Vivian." Derek leaned closer, his breath carrying the scent of the $1,500 Macallan he'd been drinking since we arrived. "These people need to understand who actually runs the Ashford legacy now. You've had your little gallery hobby, played curator for long enough. Time to let someone with actual business sense take control." The couple at the next table, Margaret and Robert Chen, major donors to the Metropolitan Museum, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Behind them, Cordelia Huxley, board member of 3 Arts Foundations, and my grandfather's longtime friend, set down her wine glass with deliberate care. Her expression remained neutral, professionally blank, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes as Derek continued his performance. "You want to know what's pathetic?" Derek's voice rose another level, ensuring the entire room could hear every syllable. "I've spent 4 years watching you pretend that degree in art history makes you qualified to manage a multi-million-dollar estate. Your grandfather built something real, and you're running it into the ground with your feelings and your precious authenticity." He picked up the papers again, smoothing them against the table with movements that looked rehearsed, practiced. I'd been so focused on the documents themselves that I'd missed what was printed on the champagne flutes the servers had placed at every table, engraved in elegant script, "To new beginnings, D and S, not D and V. Derek and Sienna, not Derek and Vivian." Lawrence Bellevue finally found his voice from the podium, his decades of managing high-stakes auctions giving him the authority to interrupt even Derek's theatrical breakdown. "Mr. Lansing, perhaps this conversation would be better conducted in private. We have a schedule to maintain, and our guest came for art, not domestic drama. This is about art." Derek stood, gesturing toward the LED screen where my grandfather's painting glowed under professional lighting. "That painting, this entire collection, it's all being mismanaged by someone who values sentiment over market reality." He turned back to me, holding out a gold pen I'd never seen before. "Sign the transfer documents, or I'll make sure everyone in this room knows exactly how you've been bleeding the estate dry with your vanity projects." I looked down at the papers. The top page detailed an immediate transfer of ownership for the Ashford collection, the Belmont estate property, and full control of the Arts Endowment Fund my grandfather had established 30 years ago. Derek's signature already decorated the bottom of each page, bold and confident, written with the flourish of someone who believed he'd already won. The camera in the corner of the gallery ceiling blinked its steady red light. I'd noticed it when we first arrived, positioned perfectly to capture the auction proceedings for insurance and archival purposes. Lawrence Bellevue ran his operations with museum-level documentation, every transaction recorded from multiple angles. I picked up the gold pen Derek offered, feeling its unfamiliar weight against my fingers. Around me, conversations had died completely. The auction house staff stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they weren't witnessing the dissolution of a marriage in real time. Cordelia Huxley caught my eye across 3 tables, and I saw the question there, the offer of intervention, if I needed it. Derek mistook my pause for surrender. His face softened into something resembling sympathy, the expression he always wore when he thought he'd broken my resistance. See? This doesn't have to be ugly. We can handle this like adults, make it clean, make it civilized. You get to keep your little gallery in the city, and I'll manage the real assets, the properties and collections that require actual financial expertise. I signed the first page, then the second, working through each transfer document with the same careful precision I'd used when cataloging my grandfather's collection after his death 3 years ago. Derek's breathing changed as he watched, becoming quicker, excited. He pulled out his phone, probably ready to text his attorney or his brother or whoever else was waiting to celebrate this moment. When I reached the final signature line, I set down the pen and looked directly at him for the first time since he'd started shouting. "The papers are signed." Derek snatched them up, checking each signature like a child examining a birthday gift. His grin spread wide enough to show his back molars. Smart choice. You just saved yourself a lot of legal fees and public embarrassment. He turned to address the room at large, still holding the documents aloft. My apologies for the disruption. Everyone. Family business, you understand? Please continue enjoying the auction. Lawrence Bellevue's expression suggested he understood nothing of the sort, but he returned to his podium with professional grace, calling for the next lot as servers began moving through the room again, refilling glasses and clearing plates. The performance was over, and Derek had gotten exactly what he wanted, or so he believed. I watched him fold the signed documents into his jacket pocket, patting the fabric to make sure they were secure. He was already pulling out his phone, typing rapidly with his thumbs, probably messaging Sienna Vale to tell her the first phase was complete. He'd been so careful about his phone for the past 3 months, keeping it face down on every surface, adding a privacy screen that made it impossible to read from an angle. If this story has you wondering what Vivian knows that Derek doesn't, hit that like button right now, because the legal trap she just activated is about to turn his victory into the biggest mistake of his life. Make sure you're subscribed because the next 30 minutes will show you exactly how a gallery owner uses art world connections to destroy someone who underestimated her. The auction continued around us, lot after lot of paintings and sculptures, changing hands for prices that would fund small businesses or college educations. Derek stayed in his seat beside me, occasionally leaning over to whisper comments about the artwork or the bidders, playing the role of supportive husband now that he'd secured what he came for. The shift was jarring, watching him transform from aggressive tyrant to charming companion within seconds. When Lot 47 appeared on screen again, my grandfather's Rousseau, with its deep jungle greens and impossible moonlight, Derek actually reached for my hand. "Beautiful piece," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone making casual observation. "Shame your grandfather never understood its real market value. With the right connections, this could bring in double what you've estimated." The catalog listed the painting's value at $2.3 million based on recent auction comparisons and the condition report from our gallery's appraiser. But something about the signature in the corner looked wrong under the LED lights. The brushstrokes slightly too uniform, the aging pattern inconsistent with the rest of the canvas. I excused myself from the table, navigating through the maze of seated guests toward the ladies' room near the gallery entrance. Cordelia Huxley intercepted me halfway there, her hand gentle on my elbow, as she steered me toward a small alcove away from the main auction space. "Vivian, sweetheart, what just happened?" Her voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the edge of outrage beneath her professional composure. That man has no legal right to demand anything from you, certainly not in front of half the arts community of this state. I know. The words came out steadier than I expected. I need you to do something for me. That withdrawal you mentioned last month, the one from the Ashford Arts Endowment Fund that didn't match any approved grants. Do you have the details? Cordelia's expression shifted from concern to understanding, the kind that comes from decades of managing foundations and recognizing embezzlement when she saw it. $185,000 over 8 months, 17 separate transactions, all with forged authorization signatures. I brought it to the board 3 weeks ago, but we've been trying to handle it quietly, internally, to avoid scandal. I need those records, all of them, and I need them tonight. Can you email them to me within the next 2 hours? She pulled out her phone immediately, fingers moving across the screen with efficiency. Already done. Vivian, if that man is stealing from your grandfather's endowment, you need to contact the authorities, not just sign over more assets to him. I'm not signing over anything. The documents he just pocketed aren't worth the paper they're printed on. But I need him to think they are for a little while longer. Cordelia's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed, with something approaching appreciation. You're setting a trap. I'm documenting reality. There's a difference. I glanced back toward the auction room where Derek remained at our table, still typing on his phone. How much of tonight is being recorded? Every second from 6 angles, plus audio backup. Lawrence Bellevue doesn't take chances with insurance claims or authenticity disputes. She paused, studying my face. You knew Derek would do this tonight, didn't you? That's why you didn't fight back, why you signed so easily. I knew he'd do it somewhere public eventually. He's been building toward this for months, getting bolder with each small theft, each forged signature. Tonight, just gave him the audience he craved and the evidence I needed. When I returned to the auction room, Derek had moved to a different table, chatting with Lawrence Bellevue and 2 other collectors I recognized from major galleries in New York and Chicago. They were laughing at something he'd said, and Derek's body language radiated confidence, success, the posture of someone who just secured a major victory and wanted everyone to know it. The rest of the auction passed in a blur of raised paddles and called prices. I sat at our table alone, watching Derek work the room, building connections he thought would help him manage my grandfather's estate. Each handshake, each exchanged business card, added another witness to his performance as the devoted husband who'd finally taken control of his wife's chaotic finances. By the time the final lot sold and guests began filtering toward the coat check, Derek had collected a small crowd of admirers. I heard fragments of his conversations as I passed, carefully edited versions of our relationship that painted him as the patient partner who'd supported my impractical dreams, until finally stepping in to save the family legacy from my mismanagement. The drive home took 23 minutes through streets empty of traffic at this late hour. Derek drove my car, his BMW having been in the shop for the past week for repairs I was supposedly paying for. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other on his phone, texting constantly while maintaining a running commentary about the auction, the paintings, the contacts he'd made. That Bellevue estate is something else, he said, as we turned onto the highway. The man knows how to run an operation, a professional, efficient, everything documented for maximum legal protection. Smart business model? I watched streetlights slide past the window, each one marking another mile toward home and the next phase of whatever Derek had planned. He'd been too confident tonight, too relaxed after forcing me to sign those documents. People who won real victories didn't need to announce them so loudly or so often. When we pulled into our driveway at 11:47 p.m., Derek's phone rang. He answered on speaker, not bothering to hide the conversation. The name on the screen read S. Vale, and Derek's entire demeanor shifted, became more intimate, more genuine than anything I'd seen from him all evening. It's done, he said, before Sienna could speak. All signed, all legitimate, all witnessed by 60 of the most influential people in the regional arts community. By this time next week, you'll be managing the Ashford collection full-time. Sienna's voice came through clear and professional, the tone of someone discussing a completed business transaction rather than the destruction of a marriage. Excellent work. Did you encounter any resistance? Nothing I couldn't handle. She knew better than to fight in front of that crowd. Reputation matters too much to these art people. One scene like tonight, and she'd be blacklisted from every gallery and auction house in 3 states. I unlocked the front door and walked inside. leaving Derek in the driveway with his phone call and his mistress. The house felt different somehow, like the air pressure had changed, or the foundation had shifted slightly. I moved through rooms I decorated with furniture I'd purchased using money from consulting work that Derek claimed was really joint income since he'd provided emotional support during late nights and difficult clients. My home office still contained my grandfather's desk, the mahogany piece he'd used for 50 years at the museum he founded. Every drawer held documentation, every file cabinet contained records of transactions and appraisals and insurance policies. I'd been meticulous about organization since his death, treating the estate management like the curatorial work it essentially was. The insurance folder sat in the third drawer down, exactly where I'd left it after reviewing the policies 3 weeks ago. I pulled it out now, spreading the documents across the desk, under the light of my grandfather's old brass lamp. The coverage for the art collection totaled $9.4 million, with individual policies for pieces valued over $500,000. 3 paintings had been reappraised in the past 4 months. The changes were subtle, buried in quarterly updates that most people wouldn't read carefully. My grandfather's Rousseau had dropped from $2.3 million to $890,000. The Monet water lilies, purchased in 1962, had been revalued from $3.1 million to $1.2 million. Even the small Degas sketch, a preliminary study for one of his ballet paintings, had fallen from $600,000 to $220,000. Each revaluation carried the signature of the appraiser, Sienna Vale, Master of Fine Arts, certified member of the American Association of Appraisers. Beneath her signature on each document was mine, or, rather, something that looked like mine, if you weren't familiar with the specific pressure points and letter formations I developed over 30 years of writing. The forgeries were good, but not perfect. My capital 5 always connected to the I with a slight upward curve, a quirk from childhood piano lessons where my teacher had insisted proper posture affected handwriting. These signatures showed a V that dropped straight into the I, the work of someone who'd studied my writing but never understood the muscle memory behind it. I photographed each document with my phone, making sure the forged signatures were clearly visible in the frame. Then I pulled out my contacts and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in 6 months: Nathaniel Pierce, attorney at law, estate planning and probate specialist, my grandfather's best friend for 43 years, and the man who drafted the will that Derek thought he'd just circumvented. Nathaniel answered on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep. "Vivian, what's wrong? Is someone hurt?" "Nobody's hurt, but I need you to pull my grandfather's will, specifically page 47. There's a clause there about coercion that I need you to explain in detail." The sound of rustling fabric came through the phone as Nathaniel apparently sat up in bed, suddenly alert. "Did someone try to force you to sign something?" "Someone succeeded in forcing me to sign something in front of 60 witnesses at the Bellevue auction house, on camera with clear audio recording. I need to know if that triggers the protection clause grandfather built into the estate structure." Nathaniel was silent for nearly 10 seconds, and I could picture him in his bedroom, probably reaching for his reading glasses and the leather notebook he always kept on his nightstand. "Vivian, if someone coerced you into signing transfer documents in a public setting with witnesses and recording, then yes, absolutely, that triggers the emergency protection protocol. Your grandfather built that clause specifically because he was nearly defrauded by a business partner in 1983. He wanted to make sure his heirs couldn't be manipulated the same way." What happens when it triggers? Everything freezes. Every account, every property, every asset connected to the Ashford estate gets locked down immediately, pending investigation. The clause gives you authority as primary heir to initiate a formal inquiry with full subpoena power. It also automatically voids any transfer documents signed under coercion, making them legally worthless regardless of witnesses or signatures. I heard Derek's footsteps on the stairs. His phone conversation with Sienna apparently finished. So the documents I signed tonight are void, completely and permanently void. More than that, Attempting to enforce them after you invoke the protection clause becomes criminal fraud. Nathaniel's voice hardened with professional outrage. Who did this to you, Vivian? Who was stupid enough to try this publicly? I'll send you everything tomorrow morning. All the documentation, the video footage, the witness statements. Right now, I just need you to start preparing the paperwork to invoke the clause. Consider it already started. I'll have preliminary filings ready by 9 a.m. Nathaniel paused. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of anger and something approaching pride. Your grandfather would be furious this happened, but he'd also be proud of how you're handling it. He always said you inherited his mind for strategy. Derek appeared in the doorway of my office, still wearing his auction clothes, still carrying the confidence of someone who'd won something valuable. I ended the call with Nathaniel and looked up at my husband, studying his expression in the lamplight. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, the casual gesture of someone relaxing after a successful evening of work. That was fast, he said, gesturing toward my phone. Already calling lawyers? Vivian, the papers are signed. It's done. Fighting this now just makes you look desperate and unstable. I wasn't calling about the papers. I was calling about the insurance policies you had Sienna forge, the ones that devalued my grandfather's collection by nearly $7 million. So you could what exactly? Take out loans against artwork you claimed was worth less? Pocket the difference between real value and appraised value? Derek's confidence flickered, but held. I don't know what you're talking about. Sienna is a licensed appraiser. Market values fluctuate. Everyone knows that. Market values don't drop by 65% in 4 months without some kind of catastrophic damage or authentication crisis. I pulled out the folders, spreading the forged insurance documents across the desk where he could see them. These signatures aren't mine, Derek. They're close, probably good enough to fool a casual observer, but they're not mine. Which means you and Sienna committed insurance fraud, which is a federal offense carrying up to 30 years in prison. The color drained from Derek's face slowly, like watching time-lapse footage of decay. He reached for the desk to steady himself, his fingers gripping the edge hard enough to show white knuckles. You're bluffing. You signed those papers at the auction tonight. You gave up the estate, the collection, all of it. You have no standing to make accusations. I stood, moving around the desk to face him directly. The papers I signed tonight are void under coercion clause 47B of my grandfather's will. Every asset just froze, Derek. Every account, every property, every painting, and, more importantly, trying to enforce documents signed under public coercion becomes criminal fraud the moment I invoke the protection protocol, which I just did when I called Nathaniel Pierce 5 minutes ago. Derek's phone started ringing before he could respond. He pulled it from his pocket with shaking hands, looking at the screen like it had personally betrayed him. The name displayed was Thomas Garrett, attorney at law, the same bargain rate lawyer who'd helped Derek draft the transfer documents he'd forced me to sign. I left Derek standing in my office, his phone ringing insistently, his face showing the first real cracks in the performance he'd been maintaining all evening. The Bellevue auction suddenly looked very different when viewed through the lens of evidence collection rather than social humiliation. 60 witnesses had seen him coerce me. 6 cameras had recorded every word. Lawrence Bellevue's meticulous documentation had just transformed Derek's victory celebration into a prosecutor's dream case. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Sunlight through bedroom windows, birds in the garden, the smell of coffee from the automatic maker I'd programmed the night before. Derek didn't come to bed. Probably spent the night in his office trying to figure out damage control with his attorney. I could hear his voice through the walls, rising and falling in urgent conversation that accomplished nothing. At 8:32 a.m., Nathaniel called with an update. I've filed the preliminary motions with Judge Eleanor Whitmore. She's agreed to an emergency hearing, given the public nature of the coercion and the clear documentation. We're scheduled for Friday morning at 9 a.m. That's 3 days from now. Can Derek access any assets before then? Everything's frozen as of 7:15 this morning. I had the bank accounts, property titles, and collection insurance all flagged with emergency protective orders. He can't sell, transfer, or mortgage anything connected to the Ashford estate without facing immediate arrest for violating a court order. I thought about Derek downstairs, probably just discovering his credit cards weren't working, his access to the estate accounts terminated, his entire financial foundation crumbling while he slept off the exhaustion of his victory celebration. Nathaniel continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd spent 40 years preparing for this exact scenario. Your grandfather built multiple layers into the protection clause. It's not just about freezing assets. It's about triggering automatic investigation into anyone who attempted the coercion. Judge Whitmore has already issued subpoenas for Derek's phone records, bank accounts, and communications with this Sienna Vale person. We'll have a complete picture of the fraud within 48 hours. There's something else. I pulled up the photographs I'd taken of the forged insurance documents. Sienna Vale isn't just Derek's mistress. She's been systematically devaluing the collection through fake appraisals, so Derek could borrow against the pieces at their real value while only owing taxes and insurance on the fraudulent lower assessments. It's a fairly sophisticated scheme. Nathaniel's voice hardened. Forward me everything you have. Insurance fraud adds federal charges to the state-level coercion case. Between the two, Derek's looking at a minimum of 15 years if convicted. I spent the rest of Wednesday morning in my gallery, the small space in downtown that Derek had called a hobby for 4 years. The walls held 6 paintings currently, a rotating collection I changed monthly based on emerging artists, and overlooked historical pieces. Each acquisition had been carefully researched, authenticated, and documented. The opposite of Derek's approach to my grandfather's estate. Emma Rodriguez, my gallery assistant, and recent graduate from the State University's art history program, arrived at 10 a.m. with coffee and concern. She'd heard about the Bellevue auction through the arts community network that shared news faster than any social media platform. Miss Ashford, people are saying your husband tried to take over the estate in front of everyone last night. Emma set down her coffee, her expression carefully neutral. Are you okay? Do you need anything? I need you to pull every authentication record we have on file for the Ashford collection pieces currently in storage. Cross-reference them with the appraisals Sienna Vale filed in the past 4 months. I want to know if she's been systematically targeting specific paintings or if this was a blanket devaluation scheme. Emma's professional composure cracked slightly. Wait, she's been filing fake appraisals? For the whole collection? For at least 12 major pieces that I've found so far. There might be more. If Derek's plan was to borrow against the art using the real values, while only maintaining insurance at the fraudulent lower rates, he's essentially been running a loan scheme that would net him millions before anyone caught on. That's actually brilliant, Emma said, then caught herself. I mean, terrible and illegal, but strategically sophisticated. Who figured it out? I did. 3 weeks ago, when I was reviewing quarterly insurance updates and noticed the Rousseau's value had dropped by nearly 2/3 without any corresponding damage report or authentication crisis. So, last night at the auction, when he forced you to sign those papers, Emma's eyes widened as she connected the pieces. You let him do it. You wanted witnesses and documentation. I wanted incontrovertible evidence in a controlled environment with professional recording equipment and credible witnesses. Derek gave me exactly that by choosing the Bellevue auction as his stage. The morning stretched into afternoon while Emma and I worked through authentication records, creating a comprehensive comparison between legitimate appraisals and Sienna's fraudulent versions. The pattern emerged clearly. Every piece she'd touched had been devalued by between 55 and 70%. Always with forged authorization signatures, always timed to coincide with Derek's loan applications at various financial institutions. By Thursday afternoon, we had a complete picture of the scheme. Derek had borrowed against 17 paintings using their real market values as collateral while maintaining insurance policies at a fraction of that value. If something happened to the art, if it was damaged or stolen, he'd collect insurance based on Sienna's fraudulent appraisals, while still owing the full loan amounts based on real values. Meanwhile, the difference between what he borrowed and what he owed in insurance premiums had gone directly into accounts we were still tracking through subpoenaed bank records. Cordelia Huxley called Thursday evening with additional information about the endowment fund withdrawals. Vivian, it's worse than I initially reported. Derek didn't just take $185,000. That was just from the primary operations account. He's been accessing the investment accounts too, liquidating long-term holdings and pocketing the proceeds. The total is closer to $412,000 over the past 14 months. Do you have documentation showing his authorization was forged? Every single transaction required your signature as primary heir and fund administrator. Every single signature is a forgery. Cordelia's voice carried barely controlled fury. He's been stealing from a charitable endowment your grandfather established to support emerging artists. The man has no conscience, no shame, no basic human decency. I need you to bring all those records to the hearing Friday morning. Can you do that? I'll be there with 3 banker's boxes full of evidence and a list of 17 artists who didn't receive grants this year because Derek stole their funding. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, more focused. I dressed in my grandmother's navy suit, the one she'd worn to my grandfather's museum dedication ceremony in 1987. Professional, understated, exactly the right message for a courtroom appearance. Nathaniel met me outside Metropolitan Court at 8:45 a.m. He carried a leather briefcase I recognized from my grandfather's study, the one with brass corners and combination locks that had held important documents for 50 years. His expression was grim, but determined. Judge Whitmore has seen the preliminary evidence, he said as we climbed the courthouse steps. She's not pleased. Apparently, she attended your grandfather's funeral 3 years ago and was very moved by his dedication to arts education. Learning that someone has been looting his legacy while pretending to be family, it's not sitting well with her. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic spaces shown in legal dramas. Judge Eleanor Whitmore sat behind a modest bench, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression suggesting she'd seen every variation of human stupidity and had stopped being surprised decades ago. Derek arrived at 8:53 a.m. with Thomas Garrett, his bargain attorney who looked increasingly aware he'd taken on a case that was spiraling beyond his competence. Derek had dressed in his most expensive suit, probably trying for the same confident authority he'd projected at the Bellevue auction. But his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook slightly when he set his briefcase on the defense table. Judge Whitmore called the hearing to order at precisely 9 a.m. She reviewed the case details with clinical efficiency, then turned her attention to Derek with an expression that could freeze water. Mr. Lansing, you stand accused of coercing your wife into signing transfer documents under false pretenses in a public setting with multiple witnesses. How do you respond to this accusation? Thomas Garrett stood quickly. Your Honor, my client maintains that the documents signed at the Bellevue auction represent a legitimate transfer of property between spouses. There was no coercion, merely a frank discussion about asset management that Mrs. Ashford's attorney is now attempting to reframe as something sinister. A frank discussion. Judge Whitmore pulled out a tablet and tapped the screen several times. She turned it toward the courtroom, and Lawrence Bellevue's security footage began playing. Derek's voice filled the room, crystal clear through the court's sound system. Sign it now, you fool, or I'll auction off your reputation before dessert is served. The footage continued for 90 seconds, showing every moment of Derek's public humiliation campaign, every threat, every gesture meant to intimidate. When it finished, Judge Whitmore set down the tablet and looked at Thomas Garrett with something approaching pity. That was your frank discussion, counselor. Would you like to revise your response? Derek whispered urgently to his attorney, but Thomas Garrett's expression suggested he was rapidly calculating the odds of salvaging anything from this disaster. Before he could respond, the courtroom door opened. Sienna Vale walked in, but not from the direction Derek expected. She didn't sit beside him or offer support. Instead, she moved directly to the witness stand, carrying a portfolio that looked professionally prepared for legal presentation. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a dark suit that read, "Federal Witness rather than Mistress." Nathaniel stood, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction. "Your Honor, may I present additional evidence in the form of testimony from Miss Sienna Vale, who has been working undercover for the past 6 months at Mrs. Ashford's request to document the fraud perpetrated by Mr. Lansing." The courtroom went silent in the way that only happens when everyone's understanding of reality shifts simultaneously. Derek's face cycled through confusion, shock, rage, and finally pure panic as he realized exactly how thoroughly he'd been trapped. What point do you think Derek realized his mistress was actually working against him the whole time? Drop your prediction in the comments, because what comes next will show you just how deep this investigation really goes. "Your Honor," Sienna Vale repeated, settling into the witness chair with practiced composure. "I'm a licensed private investigator specializing in financial fraud and art crime. Mrs. Ashford retained my services 6 months ago when she first suspected her husband was manipulating asset valuations and forging authorization signatures." Derek half stood from his chair, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to settle on any one emotion. His attorney grabbed his arm, pulling him back down while whispering urgently. Thomas Garrett looked like a man who just realized his exit strategy from this case would involve throwing his client directly under the approaching bus. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly, her interest sharpening. "Miss Vale, you presented yourself as an art appraiser to Mr. Lansing. Is that correct?" "I hold legitimate credentials in art appraisal, so the representation wasn't false. However, my primary purpose in accepting Mr. Lansing's business was to document his fraudulent activities." Sienna opened her portfolio, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "Over the past 6 months, I've collected 47 emails wherein Mr. Lansing explicitly instructed me to undervalue specific pieces from the Ashford collection. I have 12 recorded phone conversations where he detailed how to forge Mrs. Ashford's signature on insurance documents. And I have bank records showing he paid me $53,000 from the Ashford Arts Endowment Fund to facilitate this fraud." Nathaniel stood, moving to accept the documents from Sienna. He distributed copies to Judge Whitmore and, with visible reluctance, to Thomas Garrett. The courtroom filled with the sound of pages turning as everyone reviewed the evidence simultaneously. The emails were damning in their specificity. Derek's writing style shifted between casual and threatening, depending on whether Sienna was following his instructions quickly enough. One message dated 3 months ago read, "I need the Rousseau. Drop to under $900,000 by Friday. Use concerns about restoration quality or provenance gaps. I don't care which. Just make sure the paperwork looks legitimate enough to fool a bank assessor. My loan approval depends on this valuation coming in low." Another email from 6 weeks ago was even more direct. "Vivian's signature needs to look natural on these authorization forms. Study the samples I sent. The upward curve on the V is critical. Banks will compare these against existing documents in her file." Judge Whitmore read through the evidence with an expression that grew progressively darker. When she reached the recorded transcripts, she looked up at Derek with something approaching disgust. "Mr. Lansing, these conversations show you explicitly planning to commit insurance fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. You instructed Miss Vale on how to forge your wife's signature. You detailed which paintings to undervalue and by how much. You even discussed how to structure the fraud to avoid triggering bank audits." Thomas Garrett attempted to speak, but Judge Whitmore raised one hand, silencing him immediately. "I'm not finished." She turned back to Sienna. "Miss Vale, you mentioned Mr. Lansing paid you from the Arts Endowment Fund. Was that the only source of payment?" "No, Your Honor." Sienna pulled out another document, this one showing a complex web of transactions. Mr. Lansing also paid me using loans he secured against the Ashford collection at inflated real market values, while maintaining insurance at the fraudulent lower values I provided. Essentially, he borrowed money using art as collateral, paid me to help him commit the fraud, and pocketed the difference between what he borrowed and what he actually owed in insurance premiums. How much did he profit from this scheme? Based on my investigation and the forensic accounting Mrs. Ashford commissioned through her attorney, Mr. Lansing netted approximately $1.9 million over 14 months. Sienna glanced at Derek, her professional mask slipping slightly to show contempt. He was quite proud of how clever he thought he was being. Derek finally found his voice, standing despite his attorney's attempts to restrain him. This is entrapment. She was working for my wife, leading me on, encouraging me to do things I wouldn't have done otherwise. None of this is admissible. Judge Whitmore's expression suggested she'd heard this defense roughly 10,000 times and had yet to find it compelling. Entrapment requires law enforcement inducement, Mr. Lansing. Private investigators working for wronged parties are not subject to the same restrictions. Moreover, these emails show you initiated contact with Miss Vale. You proposed the fraudulent schemes, and you paid her with stolen money. She didn't entrap you. She documented you. Nathaniel stood again, approaching the bench with another folder. Your Honor, there's more. We've discovered Mr. Lansing didn't limit his fraud to his wife's estate. Through Miss Vale's investigation and subsequent inquiries to other galleries and collectors, we've identified 4 additional victims who experienced similar schemes. 4 other collectors? Judge Whitmore accepted the folder, scanning the contents rapidly. Lawrence Bellevue was the first. Mr. Lansing approached him 8 months ago with an offer to consign pieces from the Ashford collection for auction. He provided appraisals from Miss Vale showing dramatically reduced values, then borrowed against those pieces at their real market worth from a private lender who didn't cross-reference the documentation. Mr. Bellevue discovered the discrepancy only after Derek attempted to withdraw the pieces from the scheduled auction. Last week, Sienna interjected smoothly. The other 3 victims are Margaret and Robert Chen, who lost $230,000 to a similar scheme involving Derek's claims of family connections to European galleries. Cordelia, Huxley's foundation, provided a grant based on Derek's forged documentation of matching contributions that never existed. And Rowan Beckett, Derek's supposed business partner, who we've discovered, was actually helping Derek launder the stolen funds through offshore accounts in exchange for a percentage. At the mention of Rowan's name, Derek's remaining composure shattered completely. He lunged toward Sienna, his face contorted with rage, screaming about betrayal and lies. 2 bailiffs moved immediately, intercepting him before he could reach the witness stand. They forced him back into his chair with professional efficiency, while Thomas Garrett looked like he wanted to abandon his client and possibly his entire legal career. Judge Whitmore stood, her voice cutting through Derek's continued shouting. Mr. Lansing, you will control yourself immediately, or I will have you removed and held in contempt. This is a courtroom, not a stage for your theatrical breakdowns. Derek subsided into his chair, breathing heavily, his expensive suit rumpled from the bailiff's intervention. His eyes found mine across the courtroom. And for the first time since I'd met him 4 years ago, I saw genuine fear replace the manufactured confidence he'd always worn like armor. Mrs. Ashford, Judge Whitmore, addressed me directly. I understand you have additional evidence regarding the coercion incident at the Bellevue auction. I stood, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Your Honor, in addition to the security footage you've already reviewed, I have witness statements from 8 individuals who attended the auction. Each statement describes the public nature of Mr. Lansing's threats, his explicit language about destroying my reputation, and his physical intimidation tactics. Nathaniel distributed printed statements from Cordelia Huxley, Lawrence Bellevue, Margaret, and Robert Chen, and 4 other collectors who'd witnessed Derek's performance. Each account corroborated the others with consistent details about timing, language, and Derek's aggressive behavior. Judge Whitmore read through the statements with methodical attention. When she finished, she set them aside and looked at Derek with an expression that suggested she was done being patient with him. Mr. Lansing, based on the evidence presented, I'm making several immediate rulings. First, all documents signed by Mrs. Ashford at the Bellevue auction are void under the coercion protection clause of the Ashford estate will. They have no legal standing and cannot be enforced. Thomas Garrett started to object, but Judge Whitmore continued without pause. Second, I'm issuing a restraining order, preventing you from accessing any property, accounts, or assets connected to the Ashford estate. This includes the residence you've been sharing with Mrs. Ashford. You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings under supervision of a court-appointed monitor. Derek's breathing became rapid and shallow, the kind of panicked gasping that suggested his entire world was collapsing in real time. His attorney placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, but Derek shook it off, his attention fixed on Judge Whitmore, as if he could will her to change her rulings through sheer, desperate focus. Third, Judge Whitmore's voice hardened even further. I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Prosecution. The evidence suggests multiple counts of forgery, fraud, embezzlement, and coercion. The DA will determine final charges, but preliminary assessment suggests you're facing a minimum of 15 years if convicted on all counts. The courtroom door opened again, and two uniformed police officers entered. They positioned themselves near Derek's table, waiting for Judge Whitmore's signal. She glanced at the officers, then back at Derek with finality. Additionally, given the severity of the fraud, the multiple victims, and your demonstrated willingness to use intimidation tactics, I'm issuing a warrant for your immediate arrest. Officers, please take Mr. Lansing into custody. Derek tried to stand, to run, to do something that might preserve the illusion of control he'd been clinging to. The officers moved faster, professional, and efficient. Within seconds, Derek was in handcuffs, his rights being read in that flat, practiced tone that police use when they've done this 10,000 times before. "You can't do this," Derek shouted as they led him toward the door. "I'm the victim here. She set me up. All of this was a trap. All of this was documentation of your own criminal behavior, Mr. Lansing." Judge Whitmore's voice followed him out of the courtroom. "You chose to commit fraud. You chose to forge signatures. You chose to steal from a charitable endowment. Mrs. Ashford simply gave you enough rope to demonstrate exactly how far you were willing to go." The courtroom doors closed behind Derek and the officers, muffling his continued protests. The space felt larger, suddenly, emptier, like a theater after the main performance ends, and everyone remembers they're sitting in an ordinary room rather than experiencing drama. Judge Whitmore turned her attention to the remaining people in the courtroom. "Miss Vale, I'll need you to provide a complete copy of your investigation files to the DA's office by Monday morning. Can you do that?" "Already prepared, Your Honor." Sienna held up a flash drive. Everything's documented and organized by date and crime category. Email chains, recordings, financial records, witness statements, forensic analysis of forged signatures. The DA should have everything needed for prosecution. Excellent work. Judge Whitmore's expression softened slightly, the first warmth she'd shown during the entire hearing. "Mrs. Ashford, you're free to return to your property immediately. The restraining order and asset protection are now in full effect. Mr. Lansing will not be able to access anything connected to your grandfather's estate. Thank you, Your Honor." I stood, feeling lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying Derek's weight for 4 years, without realizing how heavy it had become until someone cut the rope. "There's one more thing." Judge Whitmore pulled out a document I recognized as my grandfather's will. I reviewed the full estate documentation last night after receiving Mr. Eddie Swar Pierce's emergency filing. Your grandfather was quite thorough in protecting his legacy. The coercion clause you triggered is actually one of 7 protection mechanisms built into the trust structure. He clearly understood that wealth attracts predators. He experienced that firsthand in 1983. A business partner tried something similar, though nowhere near as elaborate as Derek's scheme. My grandfather spent the last 20 years of his life making sure his heirs wouldn't be vulnerable to the same manipulation. He would be proud of how you handled this. Judge Whitmore closed the file. The case is adjourned. I'll expect updates from the DA's office regarding prosecution timeline. The courtroom cleared slowly, people filing out in small clusters that immediately began discussing what they'd just witnessed. Cordelia Huxley found me in the hallway, pulling me into a brief, fierce hug that smelled like expensive perfume and righteous anger. That man stole from starving artist Vivian. 17 grants that should have gone to young painters and sculptors ended up funding his lifestyle instead. I hope he gets every year of that 15-year sentence. Lawrence Bellevue approached next, his usual auction house composure slightly ruffled. Mrs. Ashford, I owe you an apology. I should have questioned the consignment documentation more carefully. If I'd been more thorough, I might have caught the fraud earlier. You had no reason to suspect anything, Mr. Bellevue. Derek was careful to make everything look legitimate on the surface. That's what made the scheme so effective. Still. He adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture I'd never seen from him before. If you're interested in proceeding with the actual auction of your grandfather's collection, I would be honored to handle it properly this time. No forged appraisals, no fraudulent consignments, just honest business with transparent documentation. I'll consider that. Right now, I need to focus on securing the estate and dealing with the aftermath of Derek's destruction. Nathaniel walked out of the courtroom, carrying his leather briefcase and wearing an expression of deep satisfaction. He'd known my grandfather for 43 years, watched him build the museum and endowment fund from nothing, and seen Derek systematically attempt to destroy that legacy. Having Derek arrested in open court probably felt like justice served on behalf of a friend who couldn't be there to witness it. Your grandfather would have enjoyed that, Nathaniel said, as we walked toward the courthouse exit. He always said the best revenge was giving someone enough freedom to reveal their true character, then documenting it thoroughly. The coercion clause was brilliant. I'd read the will multiple times after grandfather died, but I never fully understood the depth of protection he built in. He watched what happened to several colleagues over the years, watched predatory spouses and business partners drain estates that should have supported multiple generations. He was determined that wouldn't happen to his family. Nathaniel paused at the courthouse steps, looking out at the city spreading below us. He also left you something I'm supposed to give you after the protection clause was triggered successfully. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a sealed envelope, cream-colored paper, expensive weight, with my name written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. I recognized it immediately from years of birthday cards and letters he'd sent when I was away at college. He told me to wait until you'd proven you could protect yourself from exactly the kind of threat Derek represented. Nathaniel handed me the envelope. I think watching you orchestrate that investigation and courtroom takedown would qualify. I didn't open the envelope immediately. Instead, I held it while Nathaniel continued talking, explaining details about the asset recovery process, the timeline for Derek's prosecution, the steps needed to restore proper documentation to the estate. His words washed over me, important, but somehow distant, while I felt the weight of my grandfather's final message pressing against my fingers. When Nathaniel finally left, headed back to his office to begin the massive paperwork process of unwinding Derek's damage, I sat on a bench near the courthouse entrance and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of my grandfather's personal stationery, dated 3 weeks before his death. The letter was brief, written in his cramped, precise handwriting. Dearest Vivian, if you're reading this, you've survived someone attempting what Jonathan Reeves tried with me in 1983. I'm sorry you had to experience that betrayal, but I'm proud of how you handled it. The protection clause worked exactly as designed. There's something else you need to know, something I kept secret to protect her from exactly the kind of predatory behavior you just defended against. You have a half-sister, my daughter from my first marriage. Before I met your grandmother, her name is Margot Chen, and I've been supporting her education and career through a separate trust that wasn't included in the public estate documentation. Margot is an art conservator working in Boston. She doesn't know about her connection to the Ashford estate because I wanted to make sure anyone she eventually met loved her for herself, not for potential inheritance. But now that you've proven the protections work, now that you've shown the family legacy can be defended, it's time for you to meet her. The true inheritance isn't the money or the property or even the art collection. It's the knowledge that our family can recognize threats, document them patiently, and respond strategically. That's what I learned in 1983. And that's what you've now proven you inherited from me. Contact Nathaniel if you need help reaching Margot. Tell her everything, including why I kept her existence secret. She'll understand. With love and pride, Grandfather. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of meaning. My grandfather had spent the last 20 years of his life preparing protections, not just for the estate, but for people. He'd hidden Margot's existence to protect her from Derek-type predators, waited until I proved I could defend the legacy, then arranged for us to meet only after that defense succeeded. The courthouse steps had mostly cleared by the time I finally stood, folding the letter carefully and returning it to its envelope. 3 weeks of emotional siege warfare, 6 months of patient investigation, before that, and 4 years of slowly realizing I'd married someone fundamentally different from who he'd pretended to be. All of it culminating in a single courthouse hearing where Derek's entire constructed reality collapsed in less than 2 hours. My phone rang as I walked toward my car. Unknown number, Boston area code. I answered, knowing somehow exactly who would be on the other end. Mrs. Ashford? The voice was younger than mine, professional, carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. My name is Margot Chen. I received a letter from Nathaniel Pierce this morning explaining who I am, who we are to each other. I stopped walking, standing in the courthouse parking lot while autumn leaves swirled around my feet. Margot. Our grandfather wanted us to meet. He wanted us to meet after you proved you could protect the legacy. Margot paused, and I heard papers rustling in the background. Mr. Pierce explained what happened with your husband, the investigation, the protection clause, everything. I think grandfather would be relieved to know his precautions worked. They worked perfectly. I leaned against my car, feeling the sun warm on my face despite the autumn chill. How much did Nathaniel tell you about the estate? Enough to understand why grandfather kept me separate. He was protecting me from fortune hunters and predators who would see his daughter as a transaction rather than a person. Margot's voice carried gratitude rather than resentment. I spent my whole life thinking he abandoned my mother and me, learning he was actually watching from a distance, supporting us quietly, making sure I could build my own life without the weight of expectations or inheritance. That changes everything. He left specific instructions about how the estate should be shared. The inheritance isn't complete with just one heir. It requires both of us. Margot was quiet for several seconds. I heard traffic in the background, suggesting she was outside somewhere. Mr. Pierce mentioned something about that. A dual trust structure that activates only after both heirs are confirmed and meet specific criteria. It's elaborate, even by grandfather's standards. He was nothing if not thorough. I thought about the letter in my pocket, the multiple protection clauses in the will, the investigation I'd commissioned 6 months ago because something felt wrong, even though I couldn't articulate what. When can you come to visit? I'm actually on a train right now. I have a conservation consultation in your city next week. Perhaps we could meet then? I have a gallery downtown. Ashford Gallery, small space. Nothing like grandfather's museum, but it's mine. Come there when you arrive. I'll show you the collection he left, explain what Derek tried to do, introduce you to the protections grandfather built. I'd like that. Margot paused again, and this time, her voice carried emotion she was clearly trying to control. Mrs. Ashford, Vivian, thank you for protecting what grandfather built. Mr. Pierce told me you could have settled with Derek quietly, could have paid him off and avoided the investigation and public exposure. You chose the harder path because it was the right one. Derek would have done the same thing to someone else eventually. Men like that don't stop after one success. They just get bolder. I opened my car door, sliding into the driver's seat while keeping the phone pressed to my ear, exposing him publicly, documenting everything, making sure there's a record of exactly what he did and how he did it. That protects more people than just me. Grandfather taught us both the same lesson then. Margot's voice warmed slightly. Document reality, protect the vulnerable, and never let someone's performance of virtue distract you from their actual behavior. That's exactly what he would say. After ending the call with Margot, I sat in my car for several more minutes, watching courthouse employees leave for lunch, lawyers hustling between buildings with briefcases and urgent expressions. Somewhere in the building behind me, Derek was being processed, fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of the constructed identity he'd been maintaining for years. The criminal justice system would handle the prosecution, assign lawyers and court dates, and eventually determine sentences. Cordelia's foundation would recover what they could from Derek's seized assets. The 4 other collectors he'd defrauded would join the civil proceedings. Insurance companies would investigate their own liability for accepting forged documentation. All of that machinery was in motion now, grinding forward with the inexorable momentum of legal process. My role in Derek's downfall was essentially complete. What remained was rebuilding what he'd tried to destroy and discovering what my grandfather had actually built beneath the visible structure of estates and endowments and museum wings. 3 weeks later, I stood in my gallery waiting for Margot to arrive. Emma had helped me prepare the space, bringing out pieces from the Ashford collection that had never been publicly displayed. Small paintings my grandfather had purchased because they moved him rather than because they fit any investment strategy. Sketches and studies by artists who'd never achieved fame, but whose work carried genuine emotion. The gallery door chimed at precisely 2 p.m. Margot Chen stepped inside, and I saw immediately what my grandfather must have seen every time he looked at her. She had his eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that seemed to change color depending on the light. Her movements carried the same careful precision he'd always displayed, the thoughtfulness of someone who considered their actions before executing them. Vivian. She extended her hand, and I shook it, feeling the strength in her grip. Thank you for agreeing to meet. We're family. That makes this meeting decades overdue. I showed her through the gallery, explaining the provenance of each piece, the stories grandfather had told me about acquisitions and artists. Margot listened with the attention of someone trained in conservation, asking questions about technique and materials that revealed her deep understanding of art beyond mere appreciation. When we reached the back office, I pulled out the documentation Nathaniel had provided, the dual trust structure our grandfather had created, the way it required both heirs to be confirmed and introduced before full activation, the additional protections he'd built in, assuming that wherever there was wealth, there would be people attempting to steal it. He really didn't trust easily, did he? Margot studied the trust documents with professional interest. He trusted, but he verified, and he built systems that would protect even if trust was betrayed. I thought about Derek in jail, awaiting trial, his entire life reduced to the criminal charges that would define his future. That's what saved me when my husband tried to steal everything. Margot looked up from the documents. Mr. Pierce told me about the investigation, about hiring the private investigator to pose as an appraiser. That took incredible patience and strategic thinking. I learned from grandfather's example. He spent years building protections because he understood that patience and documentation defeat performance every time. Derek was all performance. He never understood that real power comes from actual substance, from work and creativity and legacy built over generations, rather than stolen in moments. We spent the afternoon reviewing estate documents, discussing the conservation work Margot had been doing in Boston, planning how we would jointly manage what grandfather had left. The dual trust structure required both heirs to agree on major decisions, forcing collaboration and preventing either one of us from making unilateral choices that might damage the legacy. As evening approached and Margot prepared to leave, she paused at the gallery door, looking back at the paintings we'd spent hours discussing. "Vivian, there's something you should know." When I received Nathaniel's letter, there was a second envelope included, instructions to open it only after we met face to face. She pulled out a cream-colored envelope identical to the one grandfather had left me, the same expensive paper, the same distinctive handwriting. We opened them simultaneously, standing in the gallery's fading afternoon light. My letter contained a single sentence. "Now that you've found each other, find what I left in the place where you both learned the most." Margot's letter said exactly the same thing: the museum. We spoke together, understanding immediately what grandfather meant. His museum, the one he'd founded 57 years ago, the place where I'd spent childhood weekends, and Margot, I would learn, had studied as a teenager during conservation workshops. We drove there together, using Margot's rental car, arriving as the museum prepared to close for the evening. The director recognized me immediately, and when I explained we needed to access grandfather's old office, she provided keys and offered to stay late in case we needed assistance. The office hadn't changed since his death. The museum had preserved it exactly as he'd left it, a shrine to his work and vision. Mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the leather chair worn smooth from 50 years of use. Every surface held meaning, carried memory, represented decades of dedication to art and education and legacy. Where you both learned the most? Margot moved through the space methodically, examining shelves and cabinets. For you, that might be obvious. But I was only here for summer workshops when I was 15 and 16. What would I have learned? Conservation techniques? Authentication methods? I moved to the bookshelf where grandfather had kept his reference materials on forgery detection and historical authentication. He taught me how to spot fakes by showing me real pieces and explaining what made them genuine. He did the same during my workshops. Margot joined me at the bookshelf, running her fingers along spines until she found a thick volume on Renaissance painting techniques. This book. He used it to teach authentication through understanding how artists actually worked. We pulled it from the shelf together, and a small envelope fell from between the pages, thinner than the letters we'd received earlier, sealed with wax that bore grandfather's personal seal, a design he'd used only for the most important documents. The envelope contained 2 items, a photograph and a letter. The photo showed a young man and woman standing in front of an unfinished building, construction scaffolding visible behind them. The woman was beautiful, dark-haired, visibly pregnant. The man was my grandfather, at perhaps 30 years old, his arm around the woman, both of them smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. On the back, in grandfather's handwriting, Chen Mei and me, 1973, museum construction. Margot arrives in 3 months. The letter explained what the photos suggested. Grandfather's first marriage had been brief but genuine, ending not in divorce, but in Chen Mei's death from complications when Margot was 4 years old. He'd remarried my grandmother 2 years later, building the family I knew, but he'd never stopped supporting his first daughter, never stopped protecting her from the attention and pressure that came with being publicly connected to his legacy. The final paragraph made clear why he'd hidden this history. "I kept you separate because I watched what attention and expectation did to others in our position. Children, raised as heirs, often never develop their own identities, their own passions, their own lives. I wanted both of you to become yourselves first, to build something real through your own effort before inheriting what I built. Now that you've found each other, after proving you can protect what matters, the full legacy is yours. Not just the money or property, but the knowledge that you earned the right to it through your own strength." Margot set down the letter, her hand shaking slightly. He was protecting me my entire life, and I never knew. He was protecting both of us. I looked at the photograph again, seeing my grandfather young and hopeful, standing before a museum that existed only in blueprints and ambition. This whole elaborate structure, the dual trust, the protection clauses, keeping you hidden until I proved I could defend the estate. All of it was designed to make sure we became people worthy of his legacy before we inherited it. We sat in Grandfather's office as evening became night, sharing stories about a man who'd shaped both our lives while keeping us separate to protect us. Margot described summer workshops where a visiting lecturer had paid special attention to her technique, offered guidance and opportunities she'd assumed was professional mentorship, but now recognized as paternal pride working through professional channels. I told her about childhood weekends in this museum, about Grandfather teaching me to see through paintings to the artist's hand, about lessons in patience and documentation that seemed academic until I needed them to expose Derek's fraud. The museum director found us near midnight, gently suggesting she needed to lock up. We left carrying the photograph and letter, understanding finally how Grandfather had built protection into love itself. As Margot drove back toward my gallery, Nathaniel called. The DA's office just contacted me. Derek's offering to testify against Rowan Beckett in exchange for reduced charges, from 15 years to 8, possibly 6 with good behavior. They want to know if you have any objection. I thought about the 17 artists who'd lost grants, the 4 defrauded collectors, the systematic destruction Derek had perpetrated. Tell the DA I have no objection, but I want full restitution included. Complete repayment to every person and institution he stole from. Every monthly payment will remind him what it means to build rather than steal. Nathaniel paused. That's remarkably generous, considering what he tried to do. It's strategic. Derek destroyed his own life through his choices. He doesn't need me to punish him further. Margot, listening through the car's Bluetooth, nodded. Protection and accountability, not revenge and destruction. That's the real legacy. We reached the gallery near 1 a.m., Margot's train. Back to Boston, left in 6 hours. Thank you for sharing him, she said, holding Grandfather's photograph, for protecting what he built. The dual trust requires quarterly meetings. You'll be back often? She paused before leaving. That painting in your gallery, the small landscape, have you had it authenticated recently? The Corot sketch? Not in years. Why? I think it might be a completed study rather than preliminary work. The value could be substantially higher than current estimates. I'd be honored to handle the conservation work. I watched her taillights disappear, then stood in my gallery doorway. Derek was in jail, facing consequences. Margot was revealed as family. Grandfather's protections had worked exactly as designed. But the real victory wasn't Derek's arrest or the dramatic courtroom confrontation. The real victory was standing here in my own gallery, built through my own work, knowing I'd earned the right to inherit by proving I could protect what mattered. I drove home to the house that was finally just mine, feeling not painful absence but space reclaimed, foundations solidified after removing crushing weight. My phone buzzed one final time, a text from an unknown number. Your grandfather was brilliant. The attached photo showed Margot in a conservation lab, already analyzing the Corot under professional lighting, unable to wait for official authorization. I smiled, recognizing the same impatience Grandfather had always displayed when art demanded immediate attention. I fell asleep, thinking about protection clauses that worked, about a grandfather who'd loved enough to hide one daughter while raising another, who'd trusted both of us to become worthy before inheriting. Derek had failed, because Grandfather built protections designed specifically to defeat performance with documentation. Justice wasn't always dramatic or immediate, but when properly structured and patiently executed, it arrived with precision no amount of performance could defeat.